Liz Collin here. Thank you for joining us and welcome to LizCollinReports, a place for truth and meaningful Minnesota conversations. On the podcast today, we are changing things up a bit and bringing a little true crime drama to the show. It's been 25 years since a serial killer went on a murderous rampage that claimed the lives of 5 people. A killing spree that began in Minneapolis in April of 1997, one that ended 79 days later on July 15th on the steps of a Miami Beach mansion with the murder of Gianni Versace, the Italian fashion designer. The gunman, Andrew Cunanan, died by suicide 8 days later. Many Minnesotans were glued to the more than 2-month-long manhunt, waiting for answers, including Dave Racer, who would eventually give a voice to the team who tracked Cunanan. Racer is the author of Death by Design, a detailed record of those days in history. And Dave Racer is my guest in studio this week. Dave, thank you for being here.
Oh, it's great to be here and talk about this very, very interesting and fascinating case in all its aspects.
And a case I know that consumed your life for quite a while. And I want you to take us back to how this important story began for you. Before we get too much into the case, though, take us back. You're a St. Paul native, an Air Force veteran, a teacher, all of that. But what do you remember from 25 years ago about the case and when you first heard this was happening?
25 years ago, I was a budding radio talk show host. I am not anymore, which maybe says something.
You've bloomed. That's why.
I bloomed over years. And I was watching the news just as anybody else would and thought it was fascinating that these murders had been uncovered in Minneapolis. And nobody at the time had any clue that this was going to extend across the country, even across the world, and consume the lives of police officers and FBI agents and, newsies, as they are called by my subject, Lee Ernest, who was the man who coordinated the chase across the world for Cunanan out of the Twin Cities. Lee Ernest was a BCA agent, Bureau of Criminal Apprehension agent from Minnesota. And I was doing radio at the time of the events, but 5 years later, I had just finished writing the biography of the father of the artificial heart. And before that, I had written the true story of Tom Bird's wrongful incarceration for murder. So it's kind of on a roll, right? And I got approached by a publisher to take on this book, Death by Design. So the story really is Lee Ernest as told to Dave Racer. Lee didn't write a word in the book. I wrote all of it. And it's a fascinating process because, well, the case was 5 years cold at that point. Cunanan had been gone, and Lee had things that he wanted to say. But you know what he really wanted to do, Liz, was tell the story of the police officers, the law enforcement that chased Cunanan and that caught, criticism constantly because they couldn't find the man.
And Lee Ernest is a member of the Minnesota Fugitive Task Force. That's sort of the title back then. But he watched in dismay as you write about how authors and other writers would try to get this story, straight, if you will. But you took all of his notes, worked with him, and he had this amazing recollection of the case.
Yeah, he had because he lived it 79 days. It destroyed his family life, which was part of the story, actually. When you talk about law enforcement, you talk about the public acts, but you don't think much about the effects on their family. And we wanted to show that, how hard it was to get involved in this chase that was really 24/7, constantly. And then when another person died, well, they were on his watch, as he would say, how it affected him personally, because he took that very personally, especially when William Reese died out in New Jersey, who had nothing to do with the case. And the intrigue on that murder is particularly interesting because it involved a police officer leaking to a newsie, as Lee would say, and putting out a word that ended up getting this poor guy killed.
We'll go ahead and get into each of these really gruesome and tragic deaths in a moment. But let's talk about Andrew Cunanan himself to begin with, who the story obviously starts with here, Dave. But he's born in California. He's known even as a teenager for being this prolific liar. He comes out as gay in high school, and then I even read about how he had such a temper back then. He at one point dislocated his own mother's shoulder in an argument.
Yeah, he was an excitable fellow and characterized as obnoxious and loud and had a loud cackle and yet always the life of the party, always wanting to pick up the check even though he had no money, living off of others. I think you could easily say he never had a job in his life except as a kept man, which he was at least on one occasion, maybe on more. Um, Characterized as a gay prostitute who had aged out. He was 26 or 27, I think, when he came back to Minnesota. And that was too old to continue in his profession. He actually came back to Minnesota to settle down, in a sense, to marry David Madsen. That was his goal.
So is Manson who he meets then in this California bar, and that's how this connection begins in 96, 97, when he's
No,
about
I think
27 years
that
old
I think that he was up here. They did a
to begin
lot
with?
of traveling. I mean, he was all over the place. How he managed to do that was kind of interesting. There was I can't remember the name of it now, but there was a very elite dating service for wealthy elder gay men that he worked with. But for whatever reason, he would come to the Twin Cities to party. He would go other places to party. The other thing about Cunanan that was really fascinating, made the search really hard, was that he was kind of a chameleon. He had a mixed racial background. It's kind of weird. I think of Tiger Woods when I think of him. He has this mixed racial background, and he could look like 6 different people.
He does blend in. You've seen pictures,
Yeah,
and
yeah. And I mean, when the FBI put out their photos, they had to have an array because they didn't know which one you would look like at the time. It'd be lighter skin, dark skin, hair, facial hair, not facial hair, and so forth.
So he's 27 years old in the summertime of 1997, and let's talk about his first victim, and that's Jeffrey Trail.
Yeah, so he had known and dated Jeffrey Trail in San Diego. Jeffrey Trail came to Minnesota and was working up here when when Cunanan came back to Minnesota to live with David Madsen, or try to live with David Madsen. They were all friends. They went out together to lots of places we all know where they would have their parties and so forth. And
that would be Nye's. They were frequent customers of
Bukas,
Nye's.
yeah,
Gay
gay
90s.
90s, yeah, a lot of that. And he Jeff Trail had come over to had actually talked to David Madsen about Cunanan, about not trusting him, that you don't want to be with this guy. It was really putting him down. What triggered it? The violence against Jeffrey Trail, you can't really know because you weren't there. But you can see the aftermath.
And talk about that aftermath. I'm sure that's also what haunted some of these investigators.
Well, David Madsen had gone out this particular evening. Jeff Trail came over, and I believe he came to see David. He didn't come to see Cunanan, but that's a detail I don't remember too much. But Trail came up to the apartment, and they got into an argument about Trail bad-mouthing him. And he took a hammer and proceeded to hit him, I believe it was 18 times around the head, which takes a lot of effort. And Trail went down and lay on the floor. Eventually, he wrapped him up in a rug, and the body stayed there in the apartment for several days, 3 or 4 days, with David Madsen and him, which made it very, very strange. Madsen came back with the dog and from their walk, and there was his body rolled up in a carpet. And they stayed there together. They did go out. There were people who saw them leave the apartment and come back. So, why did David Madsen stay with him? That was one of the questions. Right? So then eventually they left, and they were gone for a while. And it was just about that time when the police discovered the body, came and found the body there. And so one of the sidebars, that I think is really fascinating, the police officer on that first call called a friend of his at the Star Tribune, Annie O'Connor, and told her about this murder that they had found, and she might want to come over, right? And so this is the way it happens. The first reporter on the beat the day that they found Cunanan dead on the houseboat, 79 days later, was Annie O'Connor. It was like she opened the story and closed the story. So when I wrote the book, I tried to write from the newsmaker or the news reporter's perspective as well. I interviewed a lot of newsies, as Lee would call them. And so back to the murders, then nobody really knows where David Madsen and Cunanan went to. They actually found a ticket stub from Illinois in the car, almost as if they had gone to Illinois and come back. But they ended up in Pine City, and it was there that the second murder happened.
And talk to us about that. How much time transpires between Trail's murder and then David Manson's?
I would say maybe a week.
Okay.
Yeah, I may be off a day, but it's about a week. They left the apartment. They went away somewhere. They came back probably the following Friday. And it was about this time when Lee Ernest got involved.
And that was just through a phone call.
Happenstance. He was checking the wire. I don't remember the technical term. The police have a ticker that tells them about what's going on. They were looking for a case, or he was looking for a case, and he caught this one kind of by accident. And it was a stolen car case. Had nothing to do with murder at that point. They ended up finding that car. Where do you think? In Chicago, just down the street from Lee Miglin's place, who was the third victim.
Wow. And this is how Lee Ernest gets wrapped up in this.
Yep. He gets wrapped up in actually trying to find this car, that was down in Illinois near the Gold Coast when they found it, and had tickets on. By the way, it had been sitting there for days and days. The police did not notice that they were piling tickets on there, and that maybe this car they should check the wire. And they found out it was a stolen car at that point.
And just backing up to Dave Manson just for a bit here. So the questions that still to this day have never been answered. Is he too afraid to break free from Andrew Cunanan? Does he realize his fate because he's obviously with some sort of sociopath after we've seen what happened with Jeffrey Trail in his apartment? But those are questions that have never been answered.
They really haven't been suitably answered. Madsen's family, insisted that he was, and I'm sure he was, very upstanding, employee, very popular at work. Yeah, very successful. And why it ended up, maybe he rejected him again, But it took him out this old farmhouse. Nobody was around at the time. I was out there too, down by the lake, and shot him in the eye. And he broke his watch. But
and this was in Pine City.
This was in Pine City, yeah. So then what happens? Does he drive back to the cities for a while, or does he go to Chicago? I think he probably went to Chicago. I don't want to conjecture too much, but you have to kind of read into the story to try to figure out what happened.
And obviously back then, when this first begins in April of 97, nobody has connected that there's any connection with Jeffrey Trail and David Manson or their murders.
Not at that point.
And we also have to remember this is before cell phones, cameras everywhere. Right. It's hard to even imagine how you even track a case back then before all of that technology.
But now, to the writing of the book, Lee Ernest had kept copious notes, volumes of notes and photographs and phone records and scratch pad notes and pictures and all sorts of things that nobody had ever seen. And he instructed the officers that he worked with, FBI, all across law enforcement, this fugitive task force that he was working for is actually a combination of Hennepin County Sheriff, Ramsey County Sheriff, St. Paul Police, Minneapolis Police, BCA, FBI. It's several different law enforcement agencies, and they track down the bad guys. They get them all over the country. We wrote a couple other stories about arrests in the book. It's really fascinating how well it works, because they can track down people pretty quickly, whether they're in the United States or in another country. Cunanan was the exception.
Seemingly because it seemed so random and hard to hard to figure out where his mind was. I was just checking the date. It's May 3rd when Lee Miglin dies, and this all begins on April 27th. So this is a pretty short amount of
Pretty
time.
short amount of time.
So this is the third victim. But he was a Chicago builder, married to a very successful businesswoman. The family of Miglin seems to maintain that he did not know Andrew Cunanan, but you don't think that's the case?
Well, no, because you have to logically establish that, you don't just go to the Gold Coast and then happen to walk up an alley and happen to see this fellow in the garage and think, well, I'll go after him. Lee, who is much better versed in this than I, but even I, checking the facts I had, he had a son, Miglin had a son named Duke. Duke Miglin was in San Diego area and apparently had partied at least a few times with Andrew. And so that was a connection. Andrew was a gay prostitute who serviced wealthy older men. Is that a possibility? So I think this is kind of a fascinating part of the story. When I was in Chicago interviewing police officers and news reporters and so forth, I asked a lot of questions about Lee Miglin, of course, and he was known there, right? I had his autopsy. I had the autopsies of all of them, so I had seen it. I had seen the photos. And so I went back to Minnesota, and I got a call from the Cook County medical examiner. I mean, literally called me and he said, Mr. Racer, I heard you were down here on this Miglin case. He said, would you come back? I want to take you through the autopsy. I did the autopsy. Now, you're a reporter. I mean, when someone calls you like that, it's like, okay, when can we do this?
Yeah. But talk about a gruesome death. I mean, this was horrific.
It was terrible. So he walked me through it, every aspect of it, laid out the photos for me. And but his purpose was to make sure that I did not report that he was gay. And I thought that was rather, extraordinary that someone would actually go to that extent. And I can only think, Mrs. Miglin, I can't remember her first name, the person who, his wife who had this.
She was an entrepreneur herself.
Yeah.
Became
cosmetics line.
Yeah.
A very well-known person that they had wanted to contain this information.
Interesting.
So I I even remember he took me out for chili. It was quite a time. I was honored in a way, that I would be involved in something like this. It was so important to people that they would go to this extent to make sure the story didn't get told wrong.
And I know it is kind of gruesome, but helps with the story. Talk about his death.
Oh, my.
Miglin.
Okay, I told you how he beat Jeff Trail with a hammer 18 times and shot David Madsen through the eyeball. With Miglin, he just went nuts. He wrapped his head in duct tape, gave him a little room to breathe, open his mouth. He took a screwdriver, poked it into his chest and his belly, and turned it and twisted it. He dropped a bag of concrete on his chest, and then he tried to saw his head off.
Oh, my God.
Other than that, he didn't do too much, I guess.
Well, and that's what was interesting. The family's trying to frame it that they don't know each other, but Lee Ness maintains this is a crime of passion. This is very personal in the way that this all kind of went down.
In the book, we were careful to say this is speculation based on our best guess and tying together things. And, and the Cook County coroner said, oh, no, Mr. Miglin wasn't gay. We can't figure it out any other way. They met in a bar, whatever, down there, who knows? The fact is, if you go to Lee Miglin's, if you can find it anymore, his garage is right in the middle of a very, very busy, kind of close community. They're townhomes. They're these big 3-story, brownstone townhomes. It's not something sitting out in the middle of nowhere like these, murders often happen. And
it didn't appear to you to be random.
No, not at all. I don't know how it could be. And he had parked his car down the street. That's where it had gotten all its tickets, which triggered all this. So one of the things that happened there, later on, when we get to New Jersey, the next one, we figure out, how in the world did Cunanan ever learn how they were tracking him? This was a big deal. He stole Miglin's car, had a car phone in it, and he was driving, nobody knew where. They finally figured out he had the car, so they started tracking him through the car phone every time he would pick it up. Then they could try to find him. And so he had hung out in New York for quite a while. We think he was looking for Versace up there because Versace was due in the city. And so he hung out up there for quite a while, right? And he takes off for Florida. He's driving down the turnpike in the 95 in New Jersey. I think it's 95. Or 295, whatever it is. He's driving down this freeway and he hears on the radio, a station out of Philadelphia, that they're tracking him by the car phone. We always wondered, how in the world did the newsies get that information? And I would say, I guess I broke the story. It's in the book about the police officer from Chicago who leaked that story. The sad thing about it was that Cunanan had to get rid of the car now. And I had this experience. I went to every site, and walked through it. I'm trying to figure out, why did he go out to the cemetery?
Right. And so just to connect the dots for people listening, so William Reese is his fourth victim, and that is May 9th. So that's 6 days after Lee Miglin. But that's really an interesting twist, because William Reese is basically random, and it's because Andrew Cunanan wants his car.
Yeah, it's totally random. And if you drive down the freeway, you discover the last turnoff goes up through the town there to where the cemetery is. There's a toll road on the other side. He knows he's going to get stopped and identified on that toll road. He's got to get rid of that car. And he heads up there. He sees a sign for a cemetery. He goes out to the cemetery. There's William Reese in the cemetery caretaker's house. And he takes him down the basement and executes him, shoots him in the back of the head. We have pictures in the book. That was one we decided that we weren't going to show too much of.
He has a 12-year-old son, and he is just
terribly sad.
Kind of hailed a hero in a way in that area, and just was known for being this kind of quiet, simple man. And
yeah, he was a caretaker.
Yeah, and believed in
taking
giving
care
people
of a federal cemetery,
right.
A historic cemetery.
Yeah.
Wonderful stories about the cemetery. So now Cunanan gets back on the road in Reese's pickup truck. And he's off, and nobody knows where he is.
And nobody knows where he is for quite some time. I mean, we're talking May 9th is the killing of William Reese, and then Versace is July 15th of that year. So where is he?
And back up to, what is Lee Ernest doing? They're following every lead they can imagine. They go all over the country. They've got FBI out in the woods in New Jersey. I mean, they've got, down in San Diego, in the ports, up in San Francisco, in Chicago. I mean, everywhere they were getting reports spotting. Why? Because the guy was a chameleon. He looked like everybody. And then America's Most Wanted took the case. And they coordinated it, by the way. Donna Brandt, who was the producer there, she and I became really good friends writing this book. They coordinated the case with the FBI task force because they had to find the guy. And so I put it in the book. Some people think it's a little tedious, but the number of reports that they got, because there were thousands,
right?
In every report had to be followed up. And so you had, every time America's Most Wanted would come out, there were all over the country police officers running and chasing down leads. And most of them were totally, disconnected. There was no relevance.
And what is Lee Ernest learning at the time? And I'm sure he learns later with Versace's murder. But what is Andrew Cunanan's fascination with Versace?
With Versace, that again was never really proved. He apparently had been at a party with him 10 years earlier somewhere in San Francisco or somewhere. Versace was all over the place, and had thought he had a relationship with him, at least of some sort. The speculation is that by this time he wanted to go out with a bang. Yeah, and this would be his last, hurrah.
So he knows that he's being a hunted man and can't continue.
Yeah, whether he knew he was going to commit suicide, that's a different story. He might have wanted to commit suicide by police officer, at the time. We'll never know that. But he got to, all this time away, the police and the media all over the place are trying to figure this story out. It's getting bigger and bigger. As soon as America's Most Wanted goes on it, it really goes huge. And Lee is driving this thing. It's driving him, taking over his life. And he has, again, law enforcement, you just have no clue how hard these guys work. And Lee was not going to give up. He was going to find this guy. That's his life. It's what he does. So they did not know that he was in Florida. And he was in Florida quite a while. He had stolen gold coins from Lee Miglin's house, and he was using those. And strangely enough, he was living up in North Miami, and I was in that building, and I went to the place where he pawned his coins. They had no clue. And his name was all over the place. He was going there buying, lunches on the street, and nobody knew. But, it's a busy place, right? And he blends it. He was going to nightclubs, all kinds of things.
And just to conclude with his victims, so it's Gianni Versace out for a walk that morning of July 15th.
Yeah, so I think it's easy to figure that one out because right across the street from the mansion, as it's called, there's a berm. I sat on that berm and I stared at the house and I watched the people. That's what he did. Cunanan knew his routine. He'd get up in the morning. He'd walk down to the news cafe. I believe that he would purchase some refreshments there and his newspapers and magazines, and he'd walk back. Cunanan came across the street, shot him on the steps, through the neck. We don't have to go into a lot of detail. He bled all over the steps there. And then left and went up to the parking ramp, right up the street, up to his truck, changed clothes, and then disappeared.
Again.
And we don't know. There's an indication he may have run up the boardwalk. There's an indication that he may have taken a cab. But by then he had found a boat several miles north out, in a slip there. It wasn't the houseboat. He ended up moving to the houseboat. So he was hiding out in another boat, and the owners came. And so he got in this houseboat where he locked himself in, and that's where his life ended.
With a single gunshot to the head.
Single gunshot to the head. We have the photo. It's remarkable. I won't describe it. The way it ended up was quite fascinating to me. It was sort of like payback. But when they found out, here's Annie O'Connor down there again, right? The news reporter that started the whole thing. She's down there for the Star Tribune. All the other reporters had come home. They were tired of waiting around. Liz, there were hundreds and hundreds of reporters on that berm on Ocean Boulevard watching this thing, waiting for them to find, the killer. Well, after days and days and days, that's a lot of money, right? I mean, they had makeup tents and all this stuff down there.
And it was 8 days later when he took his life.
So they went away,
mm-hmm.
and they sent Annie down to kind of babysit the story in case something happened. And she's coming out of her building, sees something going on up on the boulevard, goes up there, and she's curious, right? Now I'm going to bless reporters. She would not move from that spot until she knew what was going on. She was there for, 15 hours or something to find out what the story was. Sunburn, no restroom break. And a caretaker had gone in on the boat and found Cunanan. Well, I think he heard the noise upstairs. That's what it was. And then Cunanan took his life in the bed there. And when Lee found out, and this is sort of anticlimactic, I guess. If you could get into the emotion of those police officers, it would make more sense. But he walked over to a chalkboard in the room where they were all working together, and he wrote, "Dead right there."
DRT.
DRT. And that was, and then, there's a lot of emotion in the room. He could go home to his daughter.
You're listening to my conversation with Dave Racer, the author of Death by Design, as we look back 25 years ago on the manhunt for Andrew Cunanan after his killing spree ended with the murder of Gianni Versace. 5 men are dead. You write in the book it had been an incredible journey for these 2 men, the enraged killer and the cop who tried to force him to the surface before he killed again, a journey that began near the Pacific Ocean in late April 1997 and ended 11 weeks later, 2,700 miles away near the Atlantic Ocean. That's it, too. You also have some insight from an FBI agent in the book.
Yeah, actually, from several. That was another thing that Lee had done. He had asked the various law enforcement, as I think I mentioned earlier, to not talk. And so there were several FBI agents who I talked with from San Diego all the way across the country. And the police officers in each jurisdiction who were involved with the case. Here in Minnesota, primarily, we talked with Lee because he knew everybody. But Chicago, what's interesting about sidebar, I don't know, the Chicago police, it was so nonchalant. Oh, yeah, Miglin died. Yep. We have a lot of murders here. It was very strange, because he was such a personality.
And you can tell as you're describing your time on this book, Dave, how you're going to all of these different locations. You felt it was so important to retrace these steps, and that must have had an impact on you even years later.
Oh, for me it did. Oh, yes, for sure. When you go and you walk in the same places and you try to imagine the person, you start to take it on. I mean, I never took on the role of a gay murderer. I don't mean that, but you try to get into his head a little bit, and what was he thinking, and you see the people and you talk with them, and you realize how extraordinary this was, and sure, it affects you. I mean, even today, thinking back, all of that discovery, and I probably can't remember 2/3 of it anymore, but it was incredible.
Well, the book is nearly
I'd like to do another one.
As you should. The book is nearly 600 pages, so there are very few details left out, which is what makes it so amazing to look back on. And Lee Ernest, you mentioned before, really wanted the world to know how hard law enforcement worked to stop Cunanan, and that was his message. He wanted to get out there. I know, sadly, you said that Ernest has since passed away.
Yes, just several years ago, he suffered a heart attack and died. It was the day after CNN had done an interview with him. This is the vagaries of life, isn't it? The strange intersections. They were revisiting the case. It was probably the 20th anniversary. I'd have to go back and look at the years, but they interviewed him for this special they were going to do on the case, and he died the next day. And at his funeral, which had a lot of police officers attending, of course, they played a video clip of that interview. How unique is that? I mean, this whole story is unique, Thank goodness it doesn't happen every day. It happens too often.
And there is still a lot of interest in this case. Netflix series, I know a London production has recently reached out to you as well, but there's been a movie. There is a fascination with what happened.
Yeah, there's been other documentaries. I always tell them they get it wrong because they base it on the wrong book. So the other major book on this was written early by Maureen Orth. I've never read it. I did not want it to affect the way I thought. I wanted to look at facts and talk to my own people. And I understand she's gone into the psyche of Cunanan a lot more. I didn't do a lot of that.
I think that would be a scary place to be. And how do you understand someone, who's capable of such terror and violence?
Exactly. Well, it is still an ongoing story, Liz. The interaction of law enforcement with the public. You and I both have a lot invested in that story, as we have watched this for so many years. A number of my best friends were police officers. I almost was at one time.
Lee Ness, I know, said you'd be a good one.
Yeah. Well, it's because I ask questions and I'm curious, right? And I did stay on a Holiday Inn Express last night, so
So you're basically there.
I'm qualified. No.
Well, I want to mention to people listening, Death by Design is available on Amazon. But Dave Racer, the author of Death by Design, again, thanks for being here today.
Thank you for letting me do this. This has been terrific.
That'll do it for this episode of Liz Collin Reports. We'll be back soon to keep meaningful Minnesota conversations going. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, follow on Spotify or any other podcast platform. To stay up to date on our podcast, articles, and video stories from Alpha News, be sure to sign up for our free daily newsletter on our website. Just head to alphanews.org. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll see you next time.